Welcome to the Sea Trade Maritime podcast. I'm your host, Gary Howard, and today I'm speaking with Nuno Nunes from Hamburg Port Consulting about the digital backbone of ports, maritime single windows, and port community systems. We cover a lot of ground in our conversation, starting with definitions of these two technologies, then on to the impacts they have on governments, ports, and shipping companies. These impacts range from the operational fuel savings and efficiencies, right through to geopolitical implications of supporting and enhancing trade. A longer episode than many you'll find on Sea Trade Maritime podcast feed, but Nuno is knowledgeable and enthusiastic about his work and has brought a list of real-world examples of how these digital systems have helped address myriad challenges faced by ports beyond simply cutting down on that paperwork. I'm ready if you are, so let's start with the introductions.
My name is Nuno. I was born in Lisbon, Portugal. I'm 42 years young, married, 2 kids. They're 9 and 11, about to become 10, 12. About myself, I'm an engineering dropout. I thought computers were not for me back then. And then I happened to work in IT for all of my career. So I was in aviation industry, in the airline digitalization for 15 years. I was head of IT strategy and architecture. I was in charge of IT investments. But since 2022, I joined the port industry. I'm an associate partner and a vice president for Americas at HPC. And HPC stands for Hamburg Port Consulting. And this is a one-stop shop management consulting firm for port investment, port operations, port automation, and digitalization. Fun fact about me, the engineering dropout and working in IT, I think it's fun enough, but I'm much more fit than I look. And, our offices are on the 4th floor. And I have this reputation that no one wants to walk up the stairs with me for some reason. And that's a fun one, I think.
Another example then of the aviation industry helping to drag maritime into the modern world with some technology. And you don't look unfit, just for the record, for listeners who I understand can't see you.
Thanks for that. You're too kind.
Cool. So before we get into the sort of nitty-gritty of this all, let's start with a definition of the maritime single window and of a port community system. Perhaps you could touch on the differences between those two things and maybe how they interact with various port stakeholders as well.
Let's take a step back. Both of these systems, these are integration technologies. And integration between systems, this is done based on 2 pillars. First, there's a technical handshake, which, the most famous nowadays are APIs. And in short, these are coded formats on how 2 applications exchange information. The same way that we're talking today. I'm born in Portugal, my mother tongue is Portuguese, but we have decided that we have a common language, which is English, that will allow us to communicate. So that is the technical handshake between us. We will talk in English. But then there's a second pillar of that integration. And this is the most important one, which is the business handshake. When 2 stakeholders, 2 people, 2 companies decide that they have information that is worth to share, that at a certain moment it's going to create value on their business, it's going to create value in their process. In the same analogy, it's about what you and me decide to exchange about in English. English is the technical handshake. What we will be talking about, PCS and MSW, will be the specific content that we both believe is valuable and interesting to exchange and to share. Now, having put this into frame, let's look into what one is and what the other is. The MSW mostly focuses on the formalities related to vessel arrivals and departures, and to its crew and or passengers. While the PCS, it's a little more granular, and it steps into the details of the goods transported and the stages that these goods take going through a port. Unloaded from the vessel, kept in the yard for a while, transferred to another vessel, train, truck. Not only what is inside those containers or what the goods are, but how do they flow through a port or a specific checkpoint. But I also see a lot of myopia associated with these 2 topics. It's a maritime single window, it's a port community system, but this is more than maritime and a port issue. This is a national trade issue. And the single window concept must spread beyond a vessel call to a specific port. And it has to integrate border controls in land ports, any other transition checkpoint where the balance between efficiency and security may cause supply chain bottleneck. That's where we see the true value of this. And for example, I recently attended the World Ports Conference, and I've seen their presentation by the government of Canada, and it was fairly interesting because they look at it from a broad national trade perspective, which I'm particularly fond of because we're no longer talking about commodities that exist on a specific port. We're talking about the strategic leverage of networks of information that generate value beyond the individual nodes, which I think it's how we should go forward.
Yeah, and I know we're about to dive into a bit more detail on that as well. We discussed a few ways of laying out this podcast, didn't we? And we ended up going a bit stakeholder by stakeholders. We've got a few people that are involved facing these systems. But let's start with those government authorities. Tell us what value these digital systems can bring to those authorities.
Yeah, first of all, trade strengthens the ties between countries and communities. I mean, studies have shown that, for example, trade is one of the most effective, long-lasting ways to de-escalate political tension, prevent conflict. Moreover, trade creates prosperity. It creates businesses, creates jobs. Ultimately, it creates tax revenue. So governments, they do have an interest in building up trade, but at the same time, they want and they need to retain control and ensure security. All of this without slowing down the supply chain. Now, think about my background coming from aviation. Let's think about an airport security check. It is effective. It is very hard to bring a bomb on board, but it's not fast. It is not efficient. And what I see that is extremely exciting about PCS and MSW technologies is that they make both possible. They find ways to accelerate trade while at the same time, they do not jeopardize security. Moreover, they enhance it. We're facing, this fast-tracked airport security, but applied to our industry, which I think is simply fantastic.
I suppose the big difference between airport security checks is on the maritime side, it feels like you're mostly eliminating a lot of quite slow paperwork and taking that over to digital systems rather than adding in something new. You're just making something that's already there a lot more straightforward.
Indeed.
Do you have any data on the economic impact that maritime single windows and port community systems can have on a region?
There's an indicator that is called the Logistics Performance Index. This is published by the World Bank. It evaluates and ranks countries based on their efficiency and on the effectiveness of their logistics systems. I mean, it covers several categories such as infrastructure, customs, track and trace capabilities, timelessness, just to mention a few that are assessed. And the World Bank, they have also sponsored and studied many implementations of maritime single windows and PCSs. They're very rich in content about these case studies. And they find a very strong relation between countries that have a very good logistics performance index and countries that have invested in data sharing platforms to support trade, such as a PCS or an MSW. This is the first indicator that there must be something there.
Yeah, I can think of a couple of countries, especially in the Middle East, that are very proud of their scores on this index and really put a focus on it as a way of seeing the outcome of the investments that they're putting in as they diversify, normally away from oil or similar. But presumably when it get down to nuts and bolts on this, it's not just as simple as, you install your PCS and then suddenly your country shoots up the rankings. What other work needs to be done alongside the technology investment in order to see the performance increase really come to life?
It would be cool if it were like that, right?
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately, if there would be an off-the-shelf, one-size-fits-all, magic PCS pill we take and it's done, it's over, then I would say we wouldn't need this podcast. We wouldn't be talking about it, right? We just get this bill somewhere. But yeah, that's definitely it. Every port has their own story, and the PCS will be part of that story. And it means that the PCS will come to resolve a problem. It will come to enable a new future. It will come to accelerate something, resolve a bottleneck. The PCS must fit into this particular geographics of the challenge that is in front of us. Now, what happens instead is it's the other way around. When a country deliberately decides that we need to improve our performance index, the government will set up a set of policies, a program, a set of projects, a set of investments that will allow this increase. And by the time this step is done, the data sharing will naturally be part of it. There's this thing that making parallel, a lot of athletes nowadays, they come forward talking about the importance of their mental health. And if we look at the parallel between those two, is that between our industry and the athletes, is that, the keys, the cranes, trucks, highways, rail tracks, these are the muscles. Of course, we need fast highways, and of course, we need cranes, and of course, we need ports, but we also need healthy brains. We also need the software that integrates and streamline things. And you mentioned it yourself many times. The parallel with the airport security is that in this particular industry, most of the time we take is not on handling the cargo. The time we take is on handling the paperwork so that we can handle the cargo. That's where we believe we also need to bring brains along with those muscles.
I like that analogy. I think that works really well. And you spoke there about the idea of there being lots of different stories and demands from ports. I know we're going to get to plenty of examples through the course of this podcast. We spoke about regional stability and how trade can facilitate and ensure peace. Can you think of any examples of sort of smoothing out trade to stabilize an economy or a region?
I particularly like the case of Armenia. It's a very recent one, and their Crossroads for Peace project. So this is a huge infrastructure development project that connects Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Iran via high-speed roads. Displays a very clear logistics and trade vision, and it has the potential to become like a sustaining pillar to de-escalate what is a long-lasting regional conflict. Obviously, this is a very complicated diplomatic endeavor. I mean, they're discussing topics as serious as land sovereignty, for example, and discussions that span over decades. And they have implications that, I'm far too underqualified to even understand. But I do recognize this, which is developing such a concept and opening the conversations with potential trade partners. This might create one positive bridge that, together with other things, could help and could be the basis for more complex, more thorough discussions. In a way, this is how a single window project starts. There's a vision and there's two stakeholders that care enough to sit and share their thoughts about it. They might not agree at first. They might not be seeing eye to everything, but they share the willingness to discuss and find a way forward. So when I hear this crossroads of peace, I see beyond those civil works of building the highways, and the bridges and the tunnels and all the challenges of that region. I see it as the basis for a single window that integrates cargo along those highways in negotiated and streamlined trade processes that are executed through single windows, port community system, border management system, call it whatever we want. But the concept is there.
And a real opportunity in that part of the world as well, with the middle corridor development and those sorts of initiatives going on around as well. Let's move on to the shipping perspective, shall we? What are the main differences that a shipping company is going to see if they call a port with the modern port community system and maritime single window in place versus a port that perhaps hasn't made that investment yet?
Yeah, first of all, fuel savings. Maritime single windows, port community systems, they are the backbone of just-in-time operations. Without it, there's no management by exception, there's no operational awareness, there is no stakeholder collaboration. Without it, we have a lot of people providing services reacting to events rather than understanding and preventing those events. That is the first one, is that when you have truly collaborative data exchange, you become aware of issues in advance so that you can prevent them rather than fix them when you're hit by those events. And the second one is efficiency. Paper-based processes are very much error-prone. They require very tedious tasks, repetitive tasks that are repeated for every single port call. And this usually adds agency costs to shipping lines. They need to have specific people on each port that they call that will handle this type of complexity. And then the more complex the process, the more expensive it gets. So if we simplify that, so we're also unlocking long-term efficiency. The third thing is, it brings a small increase of predictability to the life of our people at sea. They expose themselves to huge risks during the journey. And if we reduce administrative burdens and we increase a little bit the predictability at the port, we're actually taming one source of stress that any ship crew has. What is going to happen when I'm stepping out of the vessel? And I think it's a small contribution, but it's a very important one because it sort of explains how a port community system or an MSW creates this very positive effect throughout every single stakeholder in the supply chain. And these are the tangible announced benefits. If you go through IPSA case studies, World Bank case studies, these are the announced ones. But allow me to throw in a very personal opinion in here, is that once you start collecting historical detailed operational data, such as an MSW or a PCS does. This data has far more value than what we can foresee. Because within this data, that's where the response is to the problems that we are not yet able to see or predict. So sooner or later, I would expect that next to a PCS implementation or an MSW implementation, right next to it, we're going to have what is called a data lake. So that serves as the basis for future intelligence, for port forensics, for optimization, and even for automation. So this is not tangible one, but I do believe that with time, as these solutions mature and as they collect data, there's going to be amazing insights coming out of them.
I remember from when ships first started collecting these huge amounts of data, these data lakes being built up, and then the next challenge being how do we make use of this data and make it actionable and start making money from it rather than just being a burden on us. But yeah, a lot of opportunity, I suspect, hiding in those data lakes. You mentioned just-in-time arrival at the top there. I think perhaps since I've started covering shipping, it's one of the things that have most surprised me is that we're not further along in just-in-time arrival for the benefits that it can bring on so many fronts. And to see these systems as an enabler of that is quite heartening. Can you think of any specific examples, just going off what we just talked about, of a project that has delivered these benefits to shipping companies? And what changed from before the systems were there and once they were in place?
Yeah, I would start with Hamburg Vessel Coordination Center, PCS in Hamburg. I think this is a great example because, in particular, we worked on the definition, implementation, and operation of this for decades. And we're witnessing this firsthand as it happens, that just in time connects stakeholders makes a gigantic difference. And I will explain why. I mean, far too often, vessels would rush north to approach Hamburg. And then they would just sit outside the Elbe mouth waiting for a slot to go across. So for the people that might not be so familiar with Hamburg geography, the port of Hamburg is a seaport, but we are 100 kilometers inside the hinterland on the shore of a river. So we're a seaport, but we operate in the river. And this river has navigability restrictions. And as vessels become bigger, we can't simply just have them call the port or the terminals whenever they want. So far too often, we would have vessels in the mouth of the Elbe, and we would have to keep them waiting because the passage was blocked because there's another vessel coming up. And when such thing happens, you're burning fuel to reach north faster, only to sit and wait. And then, if this is not properly planned and articulated, you might sit and wait longer than you planned. And then everything, not only you spend more fuel to get there earlier, then you get out of those port calls later. This is disastrous. And what we see is that by coordinating port calls, by bringing predictability on each terminal visit, we would be able to avoid these type of inefficiencies. And moreover, to a few days in advance, start flagging to the shipping line what is the exact slot that you should take to reach the Elbe mouth so that you have a streamlined way to call the port or get out. This is sort of a very simple example of how just adjusting the cruising speed and reducing the waiting times would save emissions and money. Another example, it's no longer related to the vessel, but it's important to the shipping line because container and the cargo, this is what the shipping line cares, the end-to-end delivery of that cargo. And the special economic zone in Aqaba, for example, just by implementing data sharing technologies, the container processing speed doubled. And the efficiency gains when you cut something in half in the supply chain processing time is remarkable. And again, they did this by first digitally identifying trucks back in 2010. Then they move on to automated gates in 2018. And in 2021, they move forward to what they call a hinterland community system that allows stakeholders to streamline this, which is another example, not directly related to the vessel, but directly related to what happens to a container after it reaches a certain point in the hinterland. And that's what I was mentioning, that we can't just imagine that this is simply a port problem. This might go straight into the hinterland, depending on the supply chain configuration.
Those delays at the Elbe obviously impact ship operations, and then as we move on to looking at ports, there's an obvious impact as well on the port side. Suddenly the ship that you're expecting 6 o'clock doesn't come in until 10 because it's been sitting there doing nothing, or maybe even the next day. Then that creates a challenge for the port. So let's do that. Let's move on to the people perhaps most obviously impacted by these systems, which is the port themselves. What reason do your port clients give for investing in maritime single windows and port community systems?
Yeah, our vision is that this is the backbone of port digitalization. These data sharing platforms are fundamental. They are as critical as building a new terminal, acquiring more cranes, expanding terminal yards. And they're also very attractive investments because typically they have friendly financial and economic returns at a fraction of the capex of what port development and investment means. And moreover, there are even governance models with no upfront investments. So ports are concerned about cash flows, ports that are still not sure whether this is the way to go. And give you an example that I just discussed this week. South America is very much in this state. There are throughputs, there are benefits that could be unlocked, but it might be just a little bit too overwhelming for some of those ports to take a step forward. So we sort of see it as part of the future basic port infrastructure. Same criticality as cranes, energy supply, it has to exist. And I would say soon enough, shipping lines will be actually bargaining discounts. If you don't have just in time, if you don't have a port community system, you're not going to allow me to be efficient. So let's talk discounts. I think this tension sooner or later is going to be happening. But obviously, there's differences in this story, whether a port authority is public or private, for example, how much legislative autonomy it has in case it's public, or how much policy setting can they make in case it's private. But nevertheless, this traditional model of ports as landlords and terminals as container flippers, this is no longer enough. Authorities must be engaged with operators, providers, shipping lines, customs, police, border police, you name it. All these stakeholders matter in this cargo. And they must be the facilitators of the community. They have to be the ones setting up these two handshakes and taking the step forward to say, hey, I trust, I want, I agree, we're on the same page. Let's put this together.
And then can you give some examples then of ports that have particularly benefited from having these systems put in place?
Yeah, I started mentioning the Hamburg case, and it's funny because, going a little bit more into the detail of that case, it's not just the restrictions of the river, it's just that it's also affected by tides, which means that you can't just navigate within or out of the Elbe at any moment in time. This has to be coordinated. So I would say at a certain moment, we weren't even discussing a KPI. We were discussing survival. Because if vessels are getting bigger and the port is getting into a situation that it can't bring predictable operations to shipping lines, then this port is of no value, regardless if it's big or not. And there is a moment that obviously it's located in a very important region for Central Europe. So it's in the benefit of everyone that the port offers good opportunities for shipping lines, for terminal operators, for all logistics companies, etc. So I think this is a great example. It started 40 years ago. This is before there was data protection discussions, before APIs were a thing, before integration was a thing. And this is a few private companies sitting together, fierce competitors sitting together and saying, we're not going to survive this way. We have to find a way, and that way is sharing a little bit of what we do with one another so that we can all make business out of this. And it's a very, very interesting example. But I mean, I have a few more. Also Akaba, I mentioned it. And they halved their processing time just by controlling traffic beyond the gate. So they set up a few checkpoints to ensure that they make traffic flow so that the bottleneck in the gates is optimized. Then they optimize the gates, etc. But this is like almost doubling the capacity. Imagine the amount of investment required to double the capacity of a port. We are talking about billions, like with a B, like big number. Then we throw a few $1 million into one specific part of a PCS, and suddenly the processing time halves. So these are really, really interesting cases. And a few more, the Dubai has eliminated 42 million document exchange.
Whew.
I looked it up. Printing one page creates 4.9 to 6.2 grams of CO2 emissions. So we're preventing 2,000 tons of CO2 by doing that. Just that part, not to speak about all the manual work, the labor required to generate, to process, to exchange these documents. It's amazing. Singapore has announced that they are now able to do a truck check-in at the terminal in 20 seconds. I think it took me longer to say the sentence than for them to check in a truck. It's like mind blowing. And it's absolutely fantastic. And we were just talking about terminals. Does this influence a terminal? Busan Port in Korea, by adding predictability, they allowed the terminal operator to reduce shuffle movements. Shuffle movement is basically when you have to pick up a container and move it from one part of the yard to the other, or you need to remove some containers to access one that needs to be discharged. And these usually add on cost. They're inefficient moves. And the more you avoid them, the better. And by having a more predictable truck schedule and a more predictability on when the truck is going to pick up that container, allow the terminal operator to reduce these shuffle movements, so increase efficiency. And another one is in Constanza. You mentioned it yourself, the middle corridor, just a few moments ago. And restrictions in the North Corridor, restrictions in the Red Sea, so more and more cargo going through across the Caspian and across the Black Sea, ending up in Romania, in Constanza. And there's huge investments in infrastructure. Roads are being upgraded. Rail in Romania has been developed extensively. The Schengen border, the road Schengen border is now going to be moved away. So there's no longer such a long checkpoint to get by road to the Central Europe. But at a certain moment, enough with the muscles. There is a moment when you say, hey, we need to integrate something that will allow us to use all these infrastructure capacities that we have in a more integrated way. Otherwise, we're still going to be inefficient, not in those nodes, but on the transitions from one node to the other. That's where the PCS comes in, for example.
These examples cover a lot of different impacts on ports, but talking sort of a one-off operational uplift, you get this installed, something doubles or halves depending what you want to happen. Do you see diminishing returns over time as new systems and ways of working bed in?
I mean, in the end, far too often, this is implemented in a project setting. So a project has capex, it has a payback period, all of that. But I often say that, the day you launch a PCS, it is not the last day of the project. It's actually the first day of the project. The positive examples I mentioned, Hamburg, we started 40 years ago. Akawa Special Economic Zone has been working on it for 15 years. All of them have been working on it for a very, very long time. And sometimes there's too much focus on ticking this box of saying, yes, we have it, but we should focus more on bringing a very meaningful responses to the question, am I making the most out of these technologies? And I mention this because it takes time to mature. Technological platform holds the data. That's fine. That's a technical handshake. We agree to exchange data and we agree to store it and whatever. But the second part, this trustful, cooperative relationship between the stakeholders, it requires the procedures change. And this is not something that happens in the blink of an eye, just because, today is the go live date, the software is in place, so the world changed. It's not really like that. I'll give you an example of a recent project, a single window that goes live. Only 3 weeks later, the legal framework changed to recognize electronic transactions, electronic business to government transactions as valid. So it went live, but it was missing the legal framework. But once the legal framework kicks in, it's not like the day after. Every single one of the 400 customs agents are fully aware of this new legislation and how it changes their daily procedures. And this needs to be rolled out with time, shift after shift, briefing after briefing, coordination meeting after coordination meeting. This takes time. So I would say there is the patience part of it that sometimes the business cases don't depict. And to be honest, this is a good thing because We don't want customs processes to change, in a snap of a finger, just like a tech startup. We want them to keep solidity, to keep predictability. We want customs to be accountable for what they do. They prevent illegal trade. We want those processes to be steady, to be predictable, to be constant. Because the day the technology is launched is the day that step by step customs will optimize their process. This is not blink of an eye action. This is not a big bang and suddenly the pill was taken. We have the PCS pill and resolved, rather the opposite. And I think from that perspective, there has to be a sense of purpose that outlasts the life of this project. There has to be a driver that pushes this vision through. And again, Hamburg started 40 years ago. Akaba has done it for 15 years. Many of the examples that are successful are not successful overnight. They are successful throughout a long-term period. But sometimes I see this question: can we make it in 12 months? And I'm like, yeah, of course we can make it. Of course we can launch technology in 12 months. But the important question is, can we support it for 20 years? That's where the focus should be.
Great. And then going from the 20-year span to a 40-year span, we've mentioned Hamburg a few times in the conversation, and our keen listeners will notice that Hamburg is right there in the name of the company. So perhaps now's a good time just to clarify, what is HPC? What does it do? How can it help address these challenges? And what is its relationship to the city and the Port of Hamburg?
I would start by saying all these examples, we've been involved in just a few of them, and we just recognize how amazing things are done across the world in this space. But nevertheless, I dare to say that HPC is the most reputable and knowledgeable vendor-agnostic specialized consultant when it comes to designing and implementing port community systems. We have Port DNA. Our mother company runs 3 out of 4 terminals in Hamburg. We run 3 other terminals abroad in Tallinn, Odessa, and Trieste. And we also run the first fully automated climate neutral container terminal in the world, CTA. So in this setting, we have evolved to become this one-stop shop for everything related to investment, development, operations, everything that is operation native. Just a fun fact, there was a moment that HPC operated the container terminal in Odessa, a long moment, before we handed it over to our mother company that is focused on the terminal operation business, and we focused on the consulting business. But we do have this ports DNA, this operations DNA. Now, our focus is shifting towards what we believe are the 3 major digital trends in port operations, which are AI, automation, and integration. And I will focus a little bit on integration because the basis of our conversation, the PCS MSW, this is what we see. This bet that we have on integration is because, in our understanding, PCS MSW are mostly an integration endeavor. And as part of our vision, the port community systems, the single windows, border management systems, whatever we may call it, these will become the backbone of port digitalization. And in that sense, we support the design, the implementation, and the operation of a PCS, which sort of follows that cycle that I just mentioned. It's not enough. Of course, we need to design and implement, but we need to have a vision that goes beyond. And that's where I think we have a unique selling point, is that we focus on strategizing the PCS. Is it financially viable? Is it feasible? How can I fund it? Should I outsource it? What parts should I outsource? Should I own the intellectual property? Should I acquire an existing product? And these seem to be very basic questions, but sometimes there's an overlap between national security indications from a country and how far can you go on hosting these solutions on the cloud, for example. So some technical decisions need to be put in that regard. At the same time, when we look about IT capabilities that Port Authority, which is historically a landlord, needs to put together, will they have the focus and the interest of generating these IT capabilities to support an IT lifecycle, or is it something that they prefer to outsource? And by outsourcing, what risks are they taking? This goes beyond just, sending a request for a proposal and hiring a technology. It requires some deliberation on strategizing. How are we going to pose it and support it? That's one of the things. The second one, coming from our Port DNA, we play an active role on negotiating with stakeholders. In a recent engagement, the Port Authority mentioned we have a stakeholder, they're very much against the project. And it's becoming a little problematic because, they're creating noise, it's creating bad mood among the other stakeholders as well. How can we tame this? And I was like, okay, let me talk to them. And this caused a little bit of a surprise. What? Yeah, I want to talk to them. There's a stakeholder that is problematic. I want to sit with them. I want to hear their concerns, their objections. What worries them? What do they think is not worth their time? What are they so much against? And after we hear all of these, then we can come up with a plan, and we can negotiate a plan that will settle their concerns and find a way to bring them on board. Let's be clear. There will always be stakeholders that will present objections throughout the whole 40 years. Still happens in Hamburg. But it doesn't mean that we just turn our backs to it. And a few months later, when we do a health check on this implementation, the result is overwhelming because now we see that 80% of the stakeholders are saying, the solution is not perfect, but it significantly changed our life for the better. And then I ask, okay, so let's just zoom into those stakeholders that was so much against 3 or 4 or 5 months ago. What are they saying? And they're saying, no, we're struggling with A, B, and C, but this is good. And that's what we need to make sure, that the technical handshake is there, but we build throughout time the trust so that the business handshake is there as well. And finally, one of the lines that I personally find the most exciting in the future is optimizing existing PCSs. Again, I never get tired of saying it. Hamburg is on it for 40 years, Akaba for 15. Many of them have been around it for decades rather than just a couple of years. And if you have a PCS, you believe it's not used to the fullest, that's very simple. We launch a SWAT team, we review the PCS top to bottom, we understand the end-to-end processes, and we sort out a plan. This plan is going to have low-hanging fruits, things that were in front of our eyes, but just the craziness of operation doesn't allow us to see those easy things, easy benefits to collect. And sometimes you need to pause and bring some methodology to access them. That's one. And then we also set up strategic actions. How do you have a medium plan that, such as Akaba said, 2010 one step, 2018 another step, 2021 another step? How do we create this cadence that makes sense for the adoption and for the transformation that the stakeholders require? And then we repeat, after 6 months, let's redo this health check. Let's see what improved. Let's see what worked. Let's see what needs to be done. And then again, and then again, and then again, and sort of that exciting part of it that I was mentioning. This is the part that is not depicted on a business case, that is thinking about, design, implementation, handover, because once the handover is done, that's when you get the bicycle. Now you need to put in the training so that you can, cycle the Alps.
I remember cycling the Alps a long time ago. I don't think I could do it now. I suspect as well as you're doing this health check and, going back in every 6 months or so, the problems will be changing as well. Or as one problem becomes solved, becomes more efficient, it will highlight a deficiency further along the chain or elsewhere becomes more of a priority because you've solved A, B becomes more of a problem. Is that often the case as you're revisiting?
Yeah, definitely. And this is how ports operate on a regular basis. If we wouldn't be talking about port community systems and we would be talking about terminal automation, which is something that we do as well, once you act on one of the nodes, there's sort of a matrix effect. It's like when you pull the sweater of someone, you don't just pull one string. All the sweater adjusts to it when you pull it. And when you think about a port, everything seems very fixed. But when you optimize one single detail, there are ripple effects that can happen. And those can be positive, or those can also be negative. And it means that out of one optimization, sometimes we foresee other issues and we solve them in advance, but it's not like we can anticipate everything. Again, if we could, this podcast wouldn't exist. Everything would be simple and transactional and so on. So in the PCS, the same happens, is that sometimes you're just moving over and shifting over your attention to other things, or you're suddenly identifying that the situation changed. It's not like the volumes are the same. It's not like the cargo types are the same. So as you put the PCS in place, new problems pop up. And that's where there should be this long-term vision of what a PCS is to a community, that's one, and a medium-term roadmap that is capable of looking into the situation and saying, perhaps it's time to focus on this particular issue. And this particular issue might not be just inside the border of the port, but it's understanding what is happening outside the border and how can we engage with local authorities to make sure that around the city there's a nice level of traffic rather than having 6 or 7 kilometers of trucks through the city of Hamburg because of something.
Yeah. I mean, it's clear that the strategic component here is incredibly important and that you play a role in developing that. On the stakeholder side, what do the stakeholders need to bring to this process to get the most out of these digital systems? What are the sort of critical success factors for implementing a port community system?
Yeah, I would go through it stakeholder by stakeholder, just like when we started. I think first of all, governments have to play an active role on leading by example. They have to set up the tone. They have to adopt, change legislation, facilitate change, facilitate digitalization. At the same time, this is not just writing words and publish them as new legislation. This is about championing the change throughout the government departments that are affected, ensuring that customs, border police, border control, all those departments are equipped and ready to embrace change. That's fundamental. At the same time, the private sector, they have to have the patience for such a process because customs procedures, again, are not random and they will take time to consolidate. And far too often, the private sector is too focused on speed. And this creates a political pressure on focusing in ticking the box of having an MSW or a PCS rather than having streamlined processes that run through an MSW or a PCS. So this patience coming from the private sector is also important. And in a way, there's this big difference between just setting up documents, publishing regulations, and then making the individual procedural changes that make processes steady across borders. Because we also don't want that depending on the shift or whoever is working at customs this afternoon, cargo will flow faster or slower. We want to ensure that it accelerates as a whole, but there's not a big variability on the human factor. And many times we're talking about people with low computer literacy. They are already dealing with the change of going from paper-based processes into operating with the keyboard and the screen. So all of this requires time, and we don't want it to become random. In sort of 3 words, I would say, well, all parties must focus on building the trust. Second, all parties must focus on having thorough, extensive, regular communication. And all parties must have the patience to see that each organization will have a different speed of change and operate actively on it.
How do you see the market for these technologies evolving in the coming years?
There's no comprehensive research to my knowledge, but we estimate that roughly 50% of ports worldwide already have PCS or an MSW. Nevertheless, there's a BIMCO study that makes a clear separation between having a single window or having what I call a single repository of scanned documents, which is transforming a paper document into a PDF document. And apparently, according to this BIMCO study from early this year, only 2% of ports are actually using real data exchange technologies. So I think there's sort of an imbalance of attention. We spend way too much time looking into buying that bicycle rather than putting in the training required for whatever we want to do with it, be it cycle the Alps or something else. So I see 3 pillars of development. The first one is there will be ports in the need of implementing new PCSs for whatever reason, compliance with IMO, reduce congestion, improve turnaround time, catch up with competition, whatever it is. But there's also a big group of ports that will see this as too overwhelming of an investment. And new innovative models must happen. And let's be clear, these are not just small ports that don't have enough throughput. These are simply ports that have not cracked a proper business and sustainability model for their community. And this is one of the topics that I would expect in the next few years to pop up as well. And finally, I think there will be ports that have the technology in place, but they are yet to start this continuous stakeholder engagement that will create the business handshake. So they do have the technical part in place, but they're missing that step because there's no such thing as bad technology in here. This is not rocket science. This is exchanging simple messages. We're not doing anything extremely complex technology wise. It's more about how do we use it and how do we set up processes. And very often, this is what makes or breaks the implementation and the usage and the adoption and the happiness of stakeholders with the results. So, bottom line, fun times ahead.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this podcast today, a lot of examples thrown in as well. I don't think I fully understood the reach and impact that these systems have across the various stakeholders and even on a political and geopolitical level. But yeah, thanks so much for your time today, Nuno, and we'll have contact details down in the description for people that want to get in touch with HPC. Thanks for your time.
Likewise. Thanks so much. It was a pleasure.